from virtual executions to a real victim. During this case, you've heard about violent video games, a gun, and a child's knowledge of how to use it. You've heard the tragic story of the death of a child, a death that could have and should have been avoided, a death that began with the encouragement of one child to play violent video games and ended with the death of another. At the age of 10, Jesse Duran was allowed to play violent video games that were rated for mature audiences, games that glorified the execution of others. Hayden Duran bought these games for Jesse, games that a child his age never should have been allowed to play. As a plaintiff in today's case, we bear the burden of proof. We have to prove to you, by a preponderance of the evidence, our burden. By preponderance of the evidence means 50% and a feather's weight. We have to prove that it was more likely than not that Jesse Duran intentionally shot Sydney Park, making her parent, Hayden Duran, liable. To prove our burden, we have to prove 4 elements to you today. The first was that Hayden Duran was Jesse Duran's legal guardian. The second was that Jesse Duran performed an act of willful misconduct. The third was that Jesse Duran's act of willful misconduct directly and proximately led to the harm suffered by Sydney Park. And the fourth is that Sydney Park suffered harm. Now, 2 of these elements are not in dispute today. Neither side is arguing as to whether or not Hayden Duran is Jesse Duran's legal guardian. Nor is either side arguing that Sydney Park suffered harm, as she died following the shooting. Therefore, we only have 2 elements to prove to you today. That Jesse Duran performed an act of willful misconduct, and that act directly and proximately led to the death of Sydney Park. Let me begin with the first element, that Jesse Duran performed an act of willful misconduct. Willful conduct, an act of willful misconduct, simply means that Jesse Duran knew that by loading the gun and pulling the trigger that day, it was likely to result in Sydney Park's death. Earlier, you heard from Jules Sebastian, the forensic expert on the scene. He recovered a single shell casing from the Park's revolver. It had 2 fingerprints. These prints did not match Terry Chapin or any of the Parks. The only match was to that of Jesse Duran's right hand. Jesse Duran knew how to load the Parks revolver. He researched it, as you heard earlier, from Jesse Duran himself. Meaning that not only did Jesse Duran know that gun was loaded when he fired the trigger, but that he put the bullets there himself. The second element was that Jesse Duran's act of willful misconduct directly and proximately led to the death of Sydney Park. Direct and proximate means but for Jesse Duran pulling that trigger that day, Sydney Park would still be with us. Bringing you back to Jules Sebastian, the forensic expert on the scene, he discovered a large amount of gunshot residue on Jesse Duran's hands. On her right hand, he discovered a high concentration of gunshot residue. On her left, in shirt, there was gunshot residue, but less so. He determined from this that Jesse Duran had his arm extended when he pulled that trigger. From virtual executions to a real victim, this is a story of how a child's love of violent video games can become something much more. How a child's love of imaginary guns can become an obsession with real guns. Jesse was always playing with guns, whether they be in video games or toy guns. They were all he wanted to play with and all he thought about. But on August 18th, 2010, playing wasn't enough. Jesse was tired of using fake guns. He wanted to use a real gun. And that's when he found out about the Parks revolver. So he started researching guns, like how to load them. Specifically, how to load the Parks revolver. So if he ever got the opportunity to use it, he would know how. And on August 18th, 2010, he got that opportunity. And he did what he had been conditioned to do by the violent video games he constantly played. The violent video games that her parent, Hayden Duran, constantly bought her. She did what she had done so many times before. She aimed and pulled the trigger. Only this time, instead of killing an imaginary person in a game, she killed a real little girl. Sydney Park was shot in the head and died because of a child's fixation with violent video games. A fixation that Hayden Duran enabled by purchasing her child, Jesse, whatever violent games she wanted. From violent video games and a virtual execution to a real victim, 11-year-old Sydney Park. We ask that you find Hayden Duran liable for the intentional shooting carried out by her daughter, Jesse Duran. Thank you.